So what I'm hearing you say is it's like you're delivering good news here about certain ethical questions about which kinds of mental states matter to the question of how we go about finding which things have those mental states and what those mental states actually are. And the good news is that previously some people thought that maybe these ethically significant states like happiness or certain kinds of suffering are essentially private and mysterious in other ways, which would make them at best very difficult to investigate, like Rob pointed out. And you're saying, no, I'm just denying that this private stuff exists. And that's good because it means everything we care about, all this happiness or suffering, all of this is, in principle at least, investigable. It's in the public sphere there. It's not closed off behind private inner mental world.
That's exactly the message. I'm not denying that happiness and pain and so on exist, and we can recognize when they're occurring.
But the next thing I want to say is that maybe there is a kind of more pessimistic framing of exactly what you're saying, which is, well, maybe the story is that on lots of sensible sounding ethical views, questions about ethics, they kind of bottom out, they ground out on mental states that we take to kind of matter in some intrinsic or fundamental way, right? So certainly when I experience really bad pain or I'm really happy, feels to me like these are mental states which are kind of, they don't matter with respect to something else. They're just intrinsically good or bad. And indeed, they have all these problematic features, they do really actually feel kind of private and essential and ineffable. And part of me thinks that's part of what makes them important. And you're denying that this kind of phenomenal consciousness exists at all. And so maybe the feeling is a bit like the rug has been pulled out of any kind of ethical enterprise that tries to ground out what matters in these kinds of mental states. And that feels a bit worrying, a bit destabilizing. Maybe the question is something like, where do you go from there? What do you identify as the things that actually matter once you've got rid of the kind of obvious candidates? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to use an example that I often use and which I borrowed from Daniel Dennett. It's a lovely example, one of the best little thought experiments in this area. It's about the value of a currency, a dollar, say. And as Dennett points out, the Americans tend to feel that the dollar has a kind of intrinsic value to it that other currencies don't have, that other currencies are like they're kind of foreign people, other people have these bits of paper that they exchange and that they can get things for and so on. And you can exchange these for dollars perhaps, but dollars are the ones that have the real value. They have a kind of intrinsic value that's sort of vim, I think he calls it, that you can sort of just feel it. That's you just. But of course they don't. They're just tokens, and their whole power resides in what you can do with them. And the notion of the vim, the intrinsic power of the dollar is a sort of illusion. But it's not an illusion based on nothing. And this is why I would add to Dennett's point here is that when you talk about the value of a dollar, someone who's accustomed to using dollars, you see, this is why it's not just a sort of a anti-American point to say that Americans think of this. Any currency that you're familiar with, you're kind of aware of its potency. You're aware of the things that it affords you. You can do things with this. You can get things with it. It seems to have a power, and we kind of conceptualize that power as something residing in the thing itself. Whereas, of course, it isn't. It's just a matter of the social conventions and so on, and what other people will give you for it and so on. And that's very much how I think about consciousness, that we feel that these states have some sort of intrinsic nature to them that grounds their potency. But really, it's a matter of what they do, of what effects this state has on you. And so I'll tell you my own little sort of version of this, which asks you to imagine, to think about pain. And now let's take the sort of phenomenal realist view of pain. So let's think pain is, let's say, some kind of activity in certain sensory, certain pain centers in your brain. Okay, the philosophers often say that it's C fiber firing. And now, according to the traditional view, there's sort of two things happening here. First of all, those C fiber firing are having all kinds of effects on the rest of your brain, and consequently on a psychology. They're triggering beliefs. You believe something terrible's happening. They're triggering emotions. You're feeling fear and distress. They're making you anxious. They're having physiological effects. It's making you changing your hormones and so on, stress levels and things. It's making you fearful. It's maybe making you anticipate all kinds of bad consequences from the damage. It's making you want for the damage, whatever's causing the damage, to stop. It's having a host of psychological effects, many of which perhaps are you're only barely conscious of, and many of which you're not conscious of at all. And it's also supposed to have just a pure intrinsic feel to it, a pure intrinsic awfulness to it. And this, of course, is supposed to be analogous to the dollar. The dollar has this power to do things in virtue of the social conventions that you can exchange it for, what you can do with it. But it's also, according to the naive view, supposed to have this intrinsic value. And so my thought experiment imagines two different anesthetics, one of which has the effect of killing of stopping all the reactions that the pain normally triggers, but leaving the intrinsic field intact, and the other which does the opposite. All the normal reaction, the state produces all the normal reactions, all the normal psychological reactions, but it doesn't have the intrinsic awfulness to it. So if you imagine what would happen in the first case, you would react exactly as if you were in pain. You would believe you were in pain. You would want whatever's causing the pain to stop. You would feel the emotions associated with pain. You'd feel fear, and you would cry out. You would beg for help, and so on and so on. All of these really complex psychological reactions and physiological reactions. But supposedly there'd be no actual intrinsic pain. In the other case, the intrinsic pain would still be there, but you would have no kind of awareness of it. It would almost be that, from a psychological point of view, it was. You weren't aware of it. You didn't notice it. You don't believe it's there. You don't feel any fear. You don't want whatever is causing the thing to stop. You're quite content, and you perhaps continue having a relaxed conversation with somebody. Now, so the question is, which would you go for? Which is the real heart of the pain? For you, which anesthetic would you take, assuming they're not, you can't take both? And which is the real source of ethical concern? Now, my intuition is that if you spell out the psychological picture, the picture of the psychological effects of pain in anything like a full detail, you will see that really that captures all that's really significant about pain. And this supposed intrinsic feel that somehow there isn't really any intrinsic feel left over at all. Certainly not something that is really the heart of the matter, any more than you need there to be an intrinsic value to the dollar. What matters is that you can buy things with it. So I think this way of thinking kind of undermines this idea that we need that we have intrinsic feels, or that they would matter if they did. So I think once you start to really pull this apart, this kind of natural way of talking, that yes, there's this intrinsic feel, you see that it's really just shorthand for your sense of all the effects of the state, just as your talk of the intrinsic value of the dollar is a sort of shorthand for everything you can do with a dollar.
So, Finn, maybe you can do a poll of your listeners. You could do some experimental philosophy, because as an intuition pump, that experiment actually pushes me towards caring about the intrinsic feel. I would take the pill that gets rid of the intrinsic feel, especially if we can bracket that the reactions aren't going to have downstream effects of, bodily damage will cause future bad things to happen. But bracketing that, as I take it we're meant to, if intrinsic awfulness did exist, granting that, I would still think that that's what matters. Now, this could be because I've spent way too much time at NYU. But more pessimistically, it could be that there is this very deep intuitive connection that we draw between phenomenal consciousness and value. And if that's true, then I'm in that sort of pessimistic place that Finn is, that we're sort of kind of out at sea, metaethically.
But I take the dollar thing again. When people talk about, assuming someone does talk about the intrinsic value of the dollar, my claim isn't that they're just talking about nothing, that there is nothing intrinsic there. But what they are trying to capture and trying to express with that language is their sense of the potency of the dollar, what they can do with it, what it affords them. So it's capturing something real and something very important. Financially, what you can do with the dollar is, and you can't do that with a foreign currency, say, if it's not legal in your country. So you don't feel that foreign currency has it. And so you're capturing something really important, something real and something financially important. Similarly, with our talk of the intrinsic feel of pain, you're capturing something real. All of this, as it were, like the impact the world is making on you right now. And that's something pretty important. And that's what you're tracking with your talk of the intrinsic feels. And that really matters, because how the world affects people matters. So if they're being damaged and hurt and treated badly, that matters. And that's what you're tracking. And if they're being treated well in ways that promote their flourishing and so on, that matters. And that's what you're tracking. You're tracking, what's really happening, if you like. But you're expressing that in the language of intrinsic feels. So I'm not saying that this way you want to conceptualize it is completely idle. You're not picking up on anything important. You are. But I don't think you have to sort of take it too literally. Now, why isn't that enough?
Finn, are you still feeling pessimistic about value? And how did that thought experiment hit you?
So I am just deeply confused now, I think. It sounds like Keith is using this thought experiment to push in the direction of illusionism. Rob is saying, well, actually, I'm kind of sympathetic to maybe the intrinsic thing mattering. And I'm not sure where to go. I think one thing, hearing you describe that thought experiment, Keith, did make me think was, well, I'm trying to imagine what it would be like in this example where I'm experiencing some kind of profoundly bad intrinsic experience, right? Intrinsic experience of pain. But it's failing to hook in functionally with anything else. So I'm behaving and I'm forming beliefs just as if I wasn't in severe pain, right? I'm like absolutely baffled by what that would be like or feel like. And maybe it's kind of so confusing that that's just indicating that the assumptions that led to thinking this is even coherent were going wrong.
That's exactly the point. I can't make sense of it either. We talk a lot about zombies and the philosophical literature of consciousness. Oh, there's another sort of character that isn't talked about much, which I want to talk about, which is what I'll call qualia agnostics. And these are people who don't psychologically, they have qualia, but they don't psychologically react to them in any way. They're not aware of them in a psychological sense. They don't notice they have them. They don't have any psychological reactions to qualia, any at all. Mm-hmm. So there could be like a sort of invert, I suppose, that the qualia are just kind of free floating, okay? And the qualia are doing whatever they're doing, they're pain, pleasure, whatever. No connection with how the person's behaving. No connection with any of their psychological reactions. Yeah. If you ask the person, what you're feeling, they give you some report that's based on their introspection of physical states, okay, not on their qualia. Then they don't notice their qualia at all. Now, it seems to me that the same considerations that support the conceivability of zombies support the conceivability of qualia agnostics, because it's the crucial point is that there's no a priori connection between functions and feel. Okay, so it seems to me that if you can conceive of zombies, you should be able to conceive of qualia agnostics. And I don't think I can.
Yeah, just to hop in and clarify what my reaction was to the thought experiment. It wasn't that I now feel like a consciousness realist because, like Finn, I'm just very confused. It's that I do feel like I draw a connection between phenomenal consciousness, which does not exist on Keith's view, and value. And so I am in a position where I'm thinking Keith is being very kind of accommodating to common sense statements like pain is bad. We're a little confused about what we mean by pain, but like that sentence is true because we are picking out these reactions, and these reactions matter. So pain is bad. Pain does matter. I've often find myself more in a mindset where I'm like, it turns out I was confused about consciousness, which I thought was the thing I knew the most about. And now that that has been kicked away by Keith and Dennett and many others, why not just think I'm extremely confused about value and what matters? In as much as illusionism is a radical picture and counterintuitive, why not go with a radical and counterintuitive view of what matters?
Oh, so you're saying that illusionism sets a sort of precedent that you might then apply in the ethical realm, that it's a sort of skepticism.
That's one thing. It would be kind of, this is like so sketchy, but it's like this very sketchy methodological thought where I feel like I'd be somewhat surprised if something that was so central to my conception of the world was wrong, and then that left a bunch of other stuff relatively unscathed, like my moral intuition about what matters.
To quickly pile in as well, I suppose an extra thing you could say is that if you were in a kind of less accommodating ecumenical mood, then presumably, if illusionism is right, then most people are just literally wrong about what matters ultimately, because if you pressed people on what they think really matters, at least when it comes to experience, they would probably say something like, well, this pain just matters intrinsically or fundamentally in a way that isn't hooked into the
well, they wouldn't use the words
reactions
probably,
at least.
but
sure, but something like that.
I think I think that's a philosophical overlay on what they would say. What they would say is, they would just point to examples. If you want to say, what do you mean by pain? And they'd say this, what happens when I stub my toe, or whatever, or I have a bad headache, or whatever it is. Everybody knows what pain is. We can recognize it. And moreover, we can recognize it perfectly well in other creatures without having any access to any private world. You can see when a dog is suffering. You don't, it's not, this is one of the, what I take as a positive consequence of illusionism, that there isn't, what matters isn't sealed off from us in separate mental worlds that are inaccessible to us. You can see where, if you attend properly, okay, people can act, people can deceive, and so on. But if you attend fully, but attending fully might even involve, having some sort of access to the actual events inside their brains. If you attend fully, you can get all the information you need. It's all out there. This is the common sense. If you asked someone on the street, how do you know that dog is suffering there? That's just been beaten or something. They're not going to say, "Well, I can't really because I can't access its private mental world of quiet." They're not going to say that. And so I think this picture of intrinsic mental qualities which we have some kind of immediate acquaintance with. This is a philosophical overlay on all of that. I mean, the ethical intuitions come first. They're grounded in how we live and how we react to each other and to the rest of the world, and they're part of what it is to be human. And we can maybe tinker around with them a bit, perhaps in the light of theory, but they're not grounded in some theory of consciousness. After all, this sort of whole approach to consciousness is one that only originated in the early modern period.
Something that Rob and I and others were talking about yesterday, as it happens, was this example of these little robot dogs that are used as kind of pack carriers for the US military, if I remember right. And someone was saying that it turns out that soldiers feel really empathetic towards these robot dogs when they kind of get knocked down or something, right? To the extent that they end up risking their own livelihoods or something, or at least taking risks to look after the robot dogs. It seems to me like maybe there isn't a sealed off private kind of fact of the matter about which things are worth caring about, but pretty obviously I don't think these robot dogs are like intrinsically worth looking after, right?
I agree. I mean, they're designed, I suppose, to display certain sort of cues, and it would be very useful to design them to display the sort of cues that trigger those kind of reactions in people, because people will look after them, protect them, and they're quite expensive. So yes, they display superficial, pretty important superficial signs of distress. But if you attend to them much more closely, and then you'll soon see that they're not displaying the psychological reactions that we'd expect.
Okay. I think I see where Finn is driving, so I'm gonna try to press it in. I think, Keith, you were saying we can just see that dogs are suffering, biological dogs, and I agree that dogs are suffering. But if by see that they're suffering you mean see just from their external behavior, that doesn't seem right.
No, you're quite right. But what we see it against a background of interaction with dogs that is much, much more complex. We live with these creatures. Well, some of us do anyway. We live with these creatures. We observe them. We interact with them in all sorts of ways. We know something. We know a great deal about their the biology and their psychology and so on. And we're interpreting this behavior that you see of this particular dog in the light of all that background knowledge, which we just don't have for these. And that's how we're interpreting the behavior of the robot dogs. But of course, the background doesn't apply to the robot dogs. What I mean is that I don't mean that we can't be tricked. Of course, we can. But there's nothing deeply hidden. There's nothing to which we don't have access in principle. That's the point.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't really a question, but I feel like I really want to just emphasize how weird this feels to me, whether or not it's right, because I really want to say that there is a fact of the matter about whether or not the lights are on in the robot dog, and you're denying any kind of deep fact about whether the lights are on.
What does that even mean?
Well, it's hard to express.
What does it mean, though, for the lights? Obviously, there are no lights, so what does it mean? Lights are on is a metaphor. Okay, so what's it a metaphor for?
This is where I think I come up blank and end up wanting to kind of point to something like this right now. This thing I'm seeing, this thing I'm experiencing. Right?
Well, this is real. Look, that's the innocent notion of consciousness. I'm quite happy with this. What's going on now? Something weird. Gosh.
Yeah.
Now, the idea that I can progress from that by sort of pure introspection to a metaphysical theory of consciousness, that's where I go wrong. I mean, one thing, for instance, we can start to pick away at this, with the sort of thought experiments that Dennett has used in his work, things like change blindness, the fact that we only have a very limited awareness of things in the periphery of our visual field, that we seem to be confronted with a rich and detailed. This rich and detailed visual world I have. No, it's not actually rich and detailed. And if you just focus, you only have fine-grained vision within about 2% or something. There's all sorts of ways that you can begin to pick away at this. Let me try. Maybe this is a good point to try one of my own favorite thought experiments here. Is that okay? I'll try one on you.
Well, just with the warning, it might push me in the wrong direction.
Okay, it's you may have heard this before. You've heard me talk about this because it's one of my favorites. It's the pickle jar. So I want some pickles. Okay, so I go to the fridge and the refrigerator, and I open the door, and I look, and I scan the inside of the fridge, and I can't see the pickles. So I call to my partner. I say, "Where are the pickles?" And she says, "They're right in the fridge. I've just put them back. They're right there. And look again." So I turn back to the fridge, and there they are, right in front of me on the middle shelf, staring me in the face, as we say. Okay. Well, I think we've all done that sort of thing. And it's also quite common, quite natural to think, hang on a minute, why didn't I spot them the first time? What was my experience of the fridge like the first time I looked? Because here they are right in front of me. How could I have missed them? Okay, so what was my experience like? What was sort of showing in this inner world where the inner lights and the inner show are? What was there at that point in my visual field the first time I looked? If I could spool back the tape of my experience and have another look at it, what would I find there at that location? And it's hard to see what could be there. I mean, if there was a pickle jar there, well, why on earth didn't I react to it? If I was looking for the pickle jar and that was actually there confronting me in my private inner world that I'm intimately acquainted with, surely I should have reacted. Was there just a sort of blank there? Well, if there was a blank, wouldn't I have noticed that there was a sort of hole? Was it filled in with other products, with milk or something? So, why? Now, it's very tempting to think there must be a determinate answer to that there must have been something there in my visual field. If there is this sort of inner world, the lights are on, what's there to see in this inner world where the lights are on? But I think, if you think about it, there doesn't have to be an answer to that question.
Yeah.
It's kind of, any answer is sort of kind of arbitrary and unsatisfactory. The fact is, I just didn't react to the presence of the pickles. I didn't react psychologically to the presence of the pickles. They didn't enter into my sort of construal of the world, my take on the world. I came away that first time with a non-pickle-based interpretation of the world. And all the reactions were sort of pickleless reactions. And that's all there was to it. There didn't have to be some rendering of the world in some inner medium for me to react to. And of course, if you say that there was an image of a pickle jar in that inner world, why didn't I react to that? Now, if you provide some sort of explanation of why I didn't react to the rendered image of the pickle jar in the private inner world, why can't I just tell that story about the actual pickle jar in the fridge? Why I didn't react to it? Okay, we just reproduce the problems. So I think that what this is trying to pick away at is the idea that we need to have this inner world, this inner rendering of the outer world. Now, if this inner world isn't a rendering of the outer world, well, what is it? I mean, if you want to say that talk of the inner lights is a metaphorical way of talking about being locked onto the outer world in a specially kind of attentive and focused way, and being aware of that locking on, then yeah, okay, I could talk about that. I could see metaphorical ways of cashing it out that are okay, but it always gets cashed out in this sort of naive, sort of rendering in phenomenal qualities way. Okay, so let's say that what we can all agree is we have this talk about the inner world, the inner lights, and what it's like, and all this. We all have this talk, and it makes sense to us. It's tracking something. Okay, now one way of cashing that out is as a rendering of the world in phenomenal qualities, mental qualities. Okay, that's one way of cashing it out. It creates all kinds of problems, but there are ways of trying to deal with them. Are there no other ways of cashing out that talk? Well, yes. And let's consider some of them, especially since the kind of realist one creates so many problems.
Yeah. I really want to say that, so I think I'm very sympathetic to everything you're saying. And if someone asked, I'd probably say I'm an illusionist about consciousness.
Oh, wow.
But whenever I really attend to, for instance, if I attend to what I'm seeing right now, and I think, well, if I take seriously the thing you just said, in some sense, there's just no deep fact of the matter about what I'm currently seeing, which is kind of a bewildering thought. Also, I'm reminded of this, I think it's NetBlock, maybe, this example where you're sitting in your room and all of a sudden you hear the air conditioner switch off.
Yeah.
And you can ask this question, was I hearing the air conditioner beforehand? Because I didn't realize it was on before it switched off. And you're saying, well, in some sense, it's just no answer to that question.
Exactly.
It's not like there was an inner sound stage which was either reproducing the sound or it wasn't.
Exactly. Again, a lot of the metaphors and things I use here are derived from Dennett. I mean, think about it like, you are kind of, your access to your own mind, to your own brain, is through a sort of public relations department, which gives you a kind of digest of what's going off. And that public relations department has a lot of information feeding into it all the time, but it's not outputting a lot. And as soon as you ask it a question, it suddenly pours out all kinds of stuff. Pay attention to what you can feel right now in your sort of left foot. Well, once you pay attention to it, you get all kinds of information about it. Maybe it feels a bit itchy or something, or maybe you're aware of its position, which and so on. Were you aware of those things before? Were they sort of present in your consciousness before? The information was being registered at some level, but it didn't have a lot of salience. And as soon as you started attending to it, it got a lot of salience, and you were able to report it and reflect on it and obsess about it, and maybe talk about the feel of it and all this stuff. There's masses of information waiting for you to tap. But if you ask, was that information rendered phenomenally before I tapped it? It's as you say, it's a non-question. And was it or wasn't it rendered phenomenally? Well, suppose there were a fact of the matter, it would still be nothing to us. I'm not persuading Rob, I can see that.
Well, actually, I'm going to turn a question back on Keith. I was going to say, the case for illusionism, I do find very compelling. I don't think I have like full belief in it, which raises the question. Keith, what is your credence in illusionism? So I think in some public forum, and certainly in conversation, I've heard Dave Chalmers give his credence in physicalism, dualism, illusionism. What's your spread?
Oh, I have this character I call the truth demon. The truth demon knows the answers to every question it asks, and it asks you to answer these questions on something like pain of death if you get them wrong. So the point is to test whether you really believe the things you profess. Do you really have more than 50% confidence? Is this really your best bet at truth? Or is it just something you say for other reasons? The truth demon tests it, gets this out of you because it's overwhelmingly your interest to get the answer right, and all other considerations fall away. So I think I probably would. I think I would say yes to the truth demon. So that's more than 50%. Yeah. Okay. Here's what's happening. My motivation used to be a prior commitment to physicalism. So it was the implausibility of the physicalist options that moved me towards something like illusionism. But I think increasingly it's more than that. It's that I don't think that phenomenal realism, quality of realism, is even coherent. And if it's not coherent, then I can't give it much credence at all. It's not just that it comes with a lot of heavy metaphysical baggage, which I don't want to take on board. It's that I can't make sense of it.
So you're good friends with Philip Goff and speak with him a lot. You also have great regard for Dave Chalmers. Yes. Neither of them have gotten you to 5% on panpsychism. Yeah. Or it's just that you can't make sense of it. And so
now, look, my credence in panpsychism conditional on realism being true would be quite high. I think panpsychism is probably the best realist theory. So I can see the route from realism to panpsychism is quite an attractive one, quite a plausible one. But realism itself, as I say, I don't make examples like the one I was using about stripping away all the reactions and leaving the pure feel, intrinsic feel. I increasingly find it hard to, or the qualia agnosiac who doesn't notice I increasingly find it hard to see what I'm supposed to be having any credence in.
That is kind of philosophically interesting question, right? Like how and whether you can have a credence in something which you think is literally incoherent, because you're not asking the question, am I in the world in which this thing is true? And I think there are like fewer worlds in which it's true than other worlds. It's more like credence in what or something.
Of course, yeah, my credence in the view would have to reflect the fact that I wasn't confident that I was right about it being incoherent.
But then you wouldn't know exactly what it is you're believing.
Yeah, I'm a fallibilist, so I could be wrong about anything. So yeah, I've got to give a rational person gives some credence to every contingent.
Some philosopher, I can't remember who said. I just heard this remark once. In order to understand a philosophical view, you have to believe it.
I don't think that's quite true in the sense that you have to. This is another thing I used to write about, but the difference between belief and acceptance, where acceptance is more like trying on a view. It's like adopting it and using it as a foundation, as a premise in your reasoning. And I think maybe you have to accept a view, at least temporarily, and think it through. And I think I've done that with panpsychism. You have to say, okay, let's say I'm a panpsychist. What follows? How does this work out? And I think you have to do that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean having a lot of credence in it, because credence is separate from acceptance. You have to try it on, try it out. It's like, you have to get in the car and take it on a test run and see how it performs. But you don't have to actually buy the car. So, right, I think we so often caricature other people's views.
So we have a lot of threads, and what Keith just said about caricaturing people, I want to flag that for later. But also, I feel like I keep derailing us, and we need to talk about the robot dogs. And we need to find out what Keith is going to do and think as we steer into the future with extremely complicated, weird, artificial beings that are sharing the world with us. Yeah. So when you wonder if we might make some sort of moral mistake about some animals or about artificial beings, how are you thinking about that mistake? What sort of mistake could we be making? Or could we make a mistake about which creatures we value and which ones we don't? Again, the realist has a picture that seems very natural to me. Ultimately, I might be confused. But the realist can say, well, there's some fact of the matter about which ones can feel pain and which ones can't. So I guess the question is, what are the conditions for it being a fact of the matter? What sort of things should we be looking for in animals and in artificial entities such that we should start caring about them?
We're sort of tuned up to react ethically, to see the world in ethical terms, to react. We don't just react on a purely sort of self-interested basis, okay? And we're tuned up to do that by, I suppose, a combination of evolution and culture, okay? Now, maybe we can change that, revise that, improve on it in the light of theoretical considerations. I don't know. But I don't think that considerations of consciousness are going to force us to do that. Because I think let's just start where we are. We're tuned up to care about other fellow creatures, other humans, animals, when they're in certain states that we recognize in ourselves generally, and which we assume they are also experiencing. Now, we're tracking something real here when we talk about this, tracking something real that occurs in us and that we assume occurs in them. And let's say we call it experience, consciousness, whatever we call it. And we can investigate what that is. We can find out what actually we are tracking. And I don't believe there's anything deeply hidden here. What we're tracking is really a bunch of complex sensitivities and reactive dispositions. Certain ways in which the world impacts on creatures, and we can say, look, we can produce a sort of list of the states in the world that matter to us, the states of other creatures that matter to us, and then maybe we can say if an artificial creature is an AI is in a suitably similar state, then we should extend our concern to it, and that's really it, as far as I see. We might then on separate independent grounds try to, it might be argued, they say on utilitarian grounds, I'd argue that we should extend this concern in various ways or take its precepts more seriously. But I don't see how considerations about consciousness as such affect any of this. Talk about suffering and so on is picking out certain states in the world, and we can investigate what those states are and extend our concern to other creatures that possess the similar ones.
So can I just to follow up on that? So what we're picking out is as you say, a complex set of dispositions.
Well, let's say that's what it is. I mean, we can find out what it is exactly. Yeah.
But I mean, for an illusionist, it will be more complex in some sense than it is for the realist, because the realist can say there's this thing we pick out, and they can use a phenomenal concept to pick it out. So it is going to be complex, let's say. We don't know exactly what it is. But given that it's complex, like on a cartoon picture, let's say that there's like 60 different complicated dispositions that we're picking out when we think about human suffering. Is there a fact of the matter about what we should do with a creature that has 40 of those dispositions? And then also, just to put it in your own terms, you said like similar dispositions is maybe something we should care about. But of course, you're going to need a similarity metric.
Multidimensional.
Yeah. Any thoughts on what that looks like?
Well, we need to have some way of mapping the complex of dispositions. I'm sketching ideas of this in terms of what I call a reaction schema, which would have multiple different dimensions. But yes, it is going to be multidimensional. And so what do you do, say, about a creature that's high on some dimensions and low on others? We have to decide. We're not, we have pretty strong intuitions about certain paradigm cases. And we have to decide how we're going to what we're going to say about ones that are more peripheral. Knowing more about what's actually happening in the paradigm cases and about how closely related the peripheral ones are to the paradigm cases should help us guide, I guess, how we extend or retract our concern. But again, it's not a matter of the lights being on or off and concern or no concern. But we need to think more generally about what we're trying to do with our ethical attitudes. This is where you need to get where you get into meta-ethics, I assume. And I don't really have a take on this, but I don't think considerations of consciousness raise problems that we don't face in other areas. It's all going to be very messy and complex and multidimensional, and we just have to try and negotiate and find a way that that we feel serves whatever purposes we think that ethics is serving, ethical discourse serves.
It's funny because in some sense it would be really suspiciously convenient if there were just kind of mental states or brain states that were somehow labeled by the universe as good or bad. And at the same time, hearing you say all this, it does feel kind of uncomfortable, right? There's like no place to rest your hat, nothing to kind of ground out in some stable, obvious way the things we care about. So I don't really know what to do with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a sort of, I guess, a kind of anti-foundationalist position in that sense, but I'm very generally anti-foundationalist. I mean, we have to make sense of things on the fly. We have to, we make sense of things by living them through, as it were. Ethical attitudes are ones that we can live through. And I'm suspicious of attempts to ground all this on some set of basic principles. I think that's kind of how ethics works. It emerges in a social setting, and as society changes and we incorporate new elements into our society, maybe artificial elements, then we change.
If a society had negotiated a line of concern that excluded dogs, say, and the society was full of dogs that were in terrible suffering, or you could take our society, which is full of factory farmed animals that are suffering terribly.
Yes, indeed.
How does one make sense of the idea that a society could be making a mistake?
Look, I'm not an ethicist, so I'm just sort of winging it here, but I'm not sure that you can you can reason people into having the right ethical attitudes. I mean, it's a matter of what kind of person you want to be and how you want to live in the world and how you want to relate to the people around you, and I don't think I can reason someone into saying that they should care about factory farming. I mean, I can point out lots of things about the similarities between the animals and the things that they themselves experience, but if they don't care about that, I don't see that I can make them care. I mean, it seems to me that the ethical problem isn't about trying to identify what matters. It's trying to get people to care about what matters. We kind of all have a pretty good grasp on the things that matter and don't matter, but some people care less than others. If you could point to certain things in the world and say, look, it's in a state that is intrinsically bad, labeled by the universe, as Finn said, well, still, I mean, someone might say, well, I just don't care that it's been labeled by the universe. And I don't know what you could say to them about that then. Say, I don't care what the universe has labeled it. You've got to care. And caring isn't a matter of, I don't think, having a certain set of beliefs. It's a matter of living in being a certain person. I'm a virtue ethicist. I mean, I'll fess up, I suppose. And, I think a virtuous person probably would have a certain amount of concern for things like the robot dogs if they...
That was going to be my question, is how do the virtues guide us as we enter this world of things that don't share ancestry with us? And not that matters, but I'm just saying, because they don't share ancestry with us, they, on all these multi-dimensional measures, probably are going to disaggregate all sorts of complicated things, be very complex in some ways, but simple in other ways, have different sensory modalities, have
absolutely
different reactions, different ways of being in the world. How do we navigate that virtuously? The virtuous approach to digital minds.
How do we do it? We, I guess, trial and error. We just try and we have to live it through. I don't think there's like a cheat sheet that can tell us how to do it. I don't think there are any sets of principles that can tell us how to do it. We've got to find a way of living in the world that we feel happy with, that we're comfortable with. Well, what if that starts to fractionate? What if different groups of us feel comfortable with different things? I don't know. There isn't. This is messy. This is horrible. This is part of being a self-aware creature. that we reflect on how we should live in the world and how we should react, and evolution has given us a good deal of freedom. It has not, it's hardwired a lot of stuff into us, but it's also made us reflective and made us able to second guess ourselves and to worry about whether we're doing things right. It's going to be really messy, and I'll tell you, okay, something here that does worry me. I suspect that once we do get pretty complex AIs, and actually I think it's going to be a long time before we get anything that's really a really serious candidate for the sort of ethical concern that we give even to other mammals. But once we do get those sort of creatures, I think there are going to be people who will say, I don't care how complex and sensitive it is and how rich its psychology is. It's just a piece of machinery and we can do what we want to it. Because they have this conception of, the inner light conception of consciousness, and they can't believe that the inner lights are on in this thing that's not in this non-biological thing. And they're going to say, we can just treat them as we want. I don't think that's a good line. I think I'd much rather be guided by, my gut feeling about these things. I mean, gut feeling based on a good deal of interaction with them and, fairly complex understanding of what they're capable of, than on some abstract theoretical principle like that.
Yeah, well, I think I would say that famously this is not the kind of conversation that often resolves itself in agreement and clarity. But the thing I wanted to say is that when it comes to thinking about what kinds of things matter, you said, well, the best we can do is play this game of reaching some kind of mutual agreement. It's a real social process. And I want to say, well, to a first approximation, we're in this world where we're industrially farming animals, and most people are fine with that. And I think that's very bad. And it's not made better by the fact that people agree it's, for the most part, that it's okay. And ditto for, historical wrongs. And I just don't know what to do with that in light of everything else you've said. But in some sense, I'm kind of happy to leave the conversation dangling on that kind of unresolved note.
When I talked about sort of establishing a sort of equilibrium, I didn't mean that, we just sort of settle and content with that. I mean, it's an evolving process, and it's very important that there are people who are continually pushing, and, the tensions within a particular picture, and, they resolve themselves and we move on, and it's a dynamic thing, and that's very important. It should be. And yeah, I mean, I'm certainly in terms of factory farming, I think we should be absolutely pushing it, and I don't see there's anything in illusionism that would deny that. There's all sorts of considerations you could appeal to. They're not living a life. They're not thriving by any conception of what thriving is, and you don't need to have any sort of story about consciousness to see that these creatures aren't thriving. And if you think, well, and of course, somebody can say, well, I don't care if they thrive. Well, if you don't care if they thrive, fine, you don't care. But well, not fine, but I can't say much to you. But the fact that they're not thriving seems to me a good reason for not doing it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this question about whether we should expect especially advanced AI systems to begin getting the same kind of problem intuitions that people have about consciousness, right? So people tend to think, as we've discussed, or at least many people tend to think, that this thing called consciousness has all these weird features. They think it's maybe kind of mysterious or raises really hard to answer questions. I suppose that might be because it's just a very contingent feature of the way we've grown up over our evolutionary history, that we're in this place where we all kind of share these strange opinions about our own minds. Or maybe this kind of illusion of consciousness, or phenomenal consciousness in particular, is a kind of attractor state in the space of possible minds. And maybe if we just kind of let the whole process go naturally, we just get more and more powerful AI systems. We should just expect them to reach the same kind of opinions about the fact that they themselves are conscious. So I don't know if you have any way of beginning to think about which way you're likely to go.
Dan Dennett and I have been working on a little project of imagining building an autonomous robot. It's starting with say something like an exoskeleton that is actually that is worn by a person. Then gradually taking the person out of the suit, and first of all having them connected by sensors and effectors in the suit, and then gradually replacing functions that were performed by the human operator by autonomous systems, and seeing what the thing needs, what the robot needs in order to carry out whatever tasks it's facing, and to see to what extent there's a need for something like a sense of, say, free will and phenomenal consciousness, to see what extent this I don't exactly say emerges, because I don't like talk of emergence, but to see what sense this comes naturally as a consequence of other capacities that we've equipped it with. I'm inclined to think something like this: that what's really going to be the driver of this is social considerations. When you get a community, say you get a community of autonomous agents together who have pretty rich kinds of sensory awareness of their environment, and can use this sensory information in really to guide a really rich range of behaviors, and so have complex reactions to sensory information. And you make these creatures social creatures who share information with each other. They're going to have one very important source of information about their environment, which it will be useful for them to share, and that's information about how things in their environment affect them. So, this thing, when you taste it, it produces this kind of complex reaction. This other thing, if you touch it, it produces another kind of very complex reaction. Now, they don't need to communicate all the details of that complex pattern of reactions, but they need to say whether it's kind of good or bad, kind of what sort of region it is. Is it a sort of complex? Is it a sort of reaction that allows you sort of fine-grained kinds of motor control, like a visual one, or is it a reaction that allows certain other kinds of reactions? They're going to need to have some crude but convenient way of packaging up information about how different aspects of the world affect them. And one way of doing this is to say how it feels. So, they'll say, well, that feels bad, don't do that. Meaning it has a cluster of reactions that the reactions that it produces are ones that are negative, ones that I regard as negative. And then they will be able to sort of nuance this in different ways, and maybe they will have these ideas of something like quality spaces where different kinds of stimuli are related to each other in different systematic ways, and other ones occupy a different sort of space of relations and so on. So they get different ideas of different sensory modalities and so on. So if that's right, and this information is very useful, then it will be natural for them to develop the sort of mental picture that we have. And also, as Dennett stresses, it may be important also to conceal information. So they're going to have this sense of that they're tracking something that only they really know about. That this is my private take on this, and I don't have to tell you about it. If they just printed out everything that occurred to them, that could be quite dangerous. They would lose all sorts of opportunities. So they create this idea of sort of curating their own experience and monitoring it and providing information about some of it and withholding information about other bits. And gradually they have this idea that what they're really in contact with is this private inner world through which the outer world is sort of filtered for them.
So yeah, I wanted to talk about Twitter. So Keith, apologies for pouring on the flattery, but like I just really enjoy your Twitter feed. Like whenever I check it, you're having some like really interesting conversation with someone, or you're kind of wondering aloud about something you've been researching in a very interesting way. And it's news to no one that that's not the norm for Twitter. Twitter can attract bad conversation and anger. I never really see any of that associated with your account, or even like close to it. Yeah, what are your motivations for using Twitter the way that you do? Do you find it useful for philosophical conversation?
Yes, I do. And I started using it when we came here to Greece. I felt a bit cut off. So I started using it to chat with people in philosophy back in the UK. And I use it partially just as a way of socializing, just of having, just the sort of conversations you would have, when I was, working at the OU, I'd just go along to somebody's office and I'd just stand in the doorway and I'd say, did you read that piece the other day? Or what did you think about that? And they'd say, whatever, I'll just go away. So I always like just chatting with people idly. And I particularly like this because when I try to write really carefully. And when I write an article, I really want to be very, very precise in what I say. And I need some channel where I can just sort of just extemporize and just talk without worrying too much about getting it exactly right and so on. And this chatting, I like doing it. So that was what I started doing. And I also just told jokes and just... And that's how I use it. I use it as... what I think... The key to it, I think, is to think of yourself as talking to real people. This is something you're saying to a real person who could be just in front of you now, just in the office next door. I don't think people use it as that. I think they're often arguing with kind of fictional characters they've created out of a bunch of tweets. They've these these little bullet-pointed tweets, and they've created this idea of this monstrous person who has these terrible views on the basis of these few things they've said, and so they go and attack this sort of Don Quixote style way. They go tilting at this sort of windmill thing that they've created, and then of course the other person does the same back. So that's what I would say. I would say if you want to make use of Twitter, find people you like, talk to them as if they were there in front of you face to face, and just don't engage in argument, because even if the cause that you're arguing for is a good one, you're really not going to achieve anything on Twitter. You're more likely to simply antagonize the other person and make them more entrenched in the view they started with. I mean, it's a tool. Let's use it creatively and constructively. It's a way in which we can all be friends. I like.
It's funny because you do argue on Twitter, Keith, but in a friendly way. So I don't mean you fight with people, you don't bicker with people, but I'll see you in the replies if someone's talking about the phenomenal concept strategy. You'll be in there pressing the table. Yeah,
no, when I said argue, I meant don't fight. I mean don't abuse. Don't. Yeah. I mean argue, rational argument. Yeah, absolutely.
In that fun way that you can do in a philosophy department.
Yeah, as you would do with somebody who you'd see face to face. Don't say anything to somebody on Twitter that you wouldn't say to them face to face. And interestingly, often, when I've met people who I've communicated with on Twitter, they're often quite different from what you imagine them to be. And they're always more complex than you imagine them to be, because people are very, very complex. And yes, they may have said something that you think is outrageous, and it may be outrageous, but that doesn't define them as a person. People are complex and are always richer and more interesting than your interpretation of them.
Wise words, indeed. It's funny, people often complain that Twitter is a kind of cesspit of rage and vitriol, and I'm sure lots of it is, but I'm always a bit confused that they haven't discovered that you can just curate who you follow.
It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful way of communicating, but again, it's what you make of it. I don't know. I think some people just enjoy abusing.
Yeah, that might be the explanation. Okay, so we have some questions which we ask all our guests at the end of interviews, and one of them is, which 3 books would you recommend for someone who is listening to this and wants to either learn more about the things we've talked about, or maybe things which actually just influenced you when you were working on this stuff?
Well, I'm going to say some obvious things. I mean, if you've not read Daniel Dennett's work on this, you've got to read it. So Consciousness Explained and Sweet Dreams, which is a lovely little book. It's a sort of follow-up to Consciousness Explained. You're probably better to read Consciousness Explained first, but Sweet Dreams takes some of it off in wonderful directions. It's a lovely little book. And I think some people misunderstand what Dennett's doing. He's not providing rigorous arguments. He's trying to get you that's not unrigorous, but he's not formulating this as a series of premises and conclusions. He's trying to get you to do this reconceptualization, to do this kind of aspect shift on consciousness, to see it from a different perspective. And you've And this is why he uses metaphors and thought experiments and so on. You've got to go along with it. You've got to go with it. You've got to let him take you to show you the view he wants to show you. I mean, you may not like the view if you don't, fine, but let him take you there. Go with him. Don't say, "Oh, this isn't about really about consciousness because consciousness is this." Yeah, he knows that you think that. He's trying to show you another way of looking at it. Go with it. Try and inhabit the view. Whenever I reread either of those books, I find myself seeing more and more of the picture. And I think they're wonderful books. So, yeah, read those. Of course, I would also suggest you read Nicholas Humphreys' book, Sold Us, from 2011, which is, as I say, today, Humphrey doesn't like the label illusionism so much, but the position is very illusionist. And it's a wonderful one about how this conception of consciousness as a private, subjective world is an adaptive one, about the wonderful effects, how it enriches our lives. And what's great, what I really like about Nick Humphrey's work is that he's got a really rich background. I mean, he's a psychologist, but he's a background in neuroscience. He knows a good deal of philosophy. He's also really widely read in arts and literature, and quotes mystics and poets, and this is what you need to talk about consciousness. You need this rich background of experience, and Nick has this, and it's a wonderful little book. He's got a new book coming out soon on about animal consciousness, which is extending the picture, and I think that would be very relevant to the people who are listening to the interest of the people who are listening to this podcast. So I really encourage you to have a look at his work. So that's two. If you want to know more about my views, you could have a look at this series of YouTube videos YouTube lectures that I recorded last year for the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies. They're on my YouTube channel, something like 12 hours of them. And so you can sit and
do a marathon.
And hear me ramble about consciousness to your heart's content. Look, also, read some of David Chalmers. I mean, read The Conscious Mind, because in many ways,
you've got to know the enemies.
I agree with Dave on a lot. I agree on the whole way that he sets it up at the beginning. The whole sort of what would have to be true, to have a reductive theory of consciousness. I agree on all of this, and I mean, Dave is himself fairly simple. I mean, he outlines an illusionist position in that book.
And he wrote this big paper about the meta problem, more or less introducing it. And I feel like, if I'm remembering it right, he says this thing at the end to the effect of, well, if it wasn't for this, in my opinion, quite difficult to understand view of his, which kind of is a realism which fits with the meta problem, then I would be an illusionist.
Yes, and he admits at the end that in terms of the dialectic, the illusionist has more to say, because in the end, all the realist can do is keep thumping the table and say, yes, but the qualia are real, damn it. And the illusionist can say, I know you think that the qualia are real, and I can explain why you think that the qualia are real and why you're banging the table. And the realist says, yes, I know you can explain why I'm banging the table and why I'm doing that, but they're still real. Right. So it's I think he probably understands the illusionist position better than as well as anyone. And maybe there's a fairly close possible world in which he is an illusionist.
Interesting. Maybe there's still hope. Okay. Last question is, it might be the case that some listeners are in fact in a position to do useful or interesting work on some of the things you've talked about. Are there specific questions or areas that you're really excited to see progress on, from the philosophical side or from the empirical side as well?
Read Dave Chalmers' paper on the meta problem is a good start to mapping out some of this stuff. There's a lot of X-Fi stuff to be done. How widespread are these intuitions about consciousness? Is it just the weird, the Western educated, etc. people who have these? So there's loads of interesting stuff to do just on trying to work out how pervasive these intuitions are and what their source is. That's the really interesting. What's the source of these? Is it just Is it just, at the one extreme, just bad philosophy? At the other end, is it some sort of hardwired subpersonal introspective processes that produce these beliefs? And I think there's a whole spectrum of position and probably some dimensions to it as well. I talk about this in some of the lectures one of the lectures that I mentioned. So there's a load of interesting stuff to do. And then you get into substantive theorizing about the nature of first order consciousness itself and the nature of our introspective access to those processes that causes our metaproblem intuitions. I think there must be some psychological story to tell there about the processes involved, even if it's overlaid heavily with cultural stuff. And as I said, there's also this wider project of trying to sort of tease people out of the Cartesian sort of way of thinking of this.
Make the world safe for illusionism.
Or not so much make it safe, make the world open to illusionism. Don't write illusionism off. That's my main objective at the moment. But there are lots and lots of projects within this. Things like change blindness and things, how studies of change blindness help to undermine intuitions about consciousness and tell us something about the nature of our reports on consciousness. Or think about looking at measures of consciousness. This is very interesting stuff. I mentioned Liz Irvin's work here. How do you measure consciousness? How do you decide whether the lights are on or off if you have that picture? And there are all kinds of different sorts of ways you might do this. And, asking people is one way, but many other indications, both voluntary and involuntary. And they don't all produce the same results. That's the point. They don't all give the same verdict. What does that tell you about the nature of the process, both about the nature of the processes you're investigating, the first order process, and about the introspective processes that generate at least the reports? Start picking it all apart. But what you should stop doing, I think, is looking for the correlates of the inner lights coming on, because that's a dead end.
Okay, final question is, where can people find you or the things you've made online?
Well, as you said, they can find me on Twitter, which is @KeithFrankish, all one word, and they can find me on my website, which is KeithFrankish, all written as one word. .com. And there's a lot of stuff on there which I'm currently in the process of updating. It's a bit out of date, but I'm putting my new stuff up there. And there's a lot of reprints of papers and various other stuff, and some limericks as well. Some philosophical limericks and a couple of rude ones.
And we will link to all of those things, limericks included, in the show notes and on the website and so on. Keith Frankish, thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
And guest interviewer Rob Long, thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was a delight.
That was Keith Frankish on Illusionism about consciousness. As always, if you'd like to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Keith. There you'll find links to all the books and resources that were mentioned, along with some further reading. As always, it would be great if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there is a link on the website to an anonymous feedback form. There's also a star rating form on the top and the bottom of the write-up. And you can send suggestions, questions, and whatever else to feedback@hearthisidea.com. In particular, we'd love to hear how you think the guest interviewer format went and whether we should experiment with that more in the future. Finally, if you would like to support the show more directly, you can also leave a tip by following the link in the show notes. Thanks very much for listening.